Just because everybody says something does not make it true. And I like to challenge commonly accepted beliefs, put it to the test, find out for myself. Is this a real thing? Is it really what's best? Let's talk about it. Hey, it's Brock here with Uncommon Aquatics, and today we're adding another Discus to this 125 gallon. And I've been talking about my Discus experiment for quite a while now, and how I'm easing into it, and I've got a 125 gallon tank over here that I'm planning to make a Discus only tank. But in today's video, I've got a lot to say. I want to talk about this tank, the way it's set up, what's in it, and why I'm putting this Discus in here. I want to talk about quarantine and why I'm not quarantining that fish. But before I do all that talking, I just want to get this guy in the water. I do love this tank. This is the tank that got me back in the hobby. And it's got an interesting mix in it. And it's not an ideal Discus tank. But we're going to go ahead and get this guy in here, and then we'll tell the story. I guess before we put him in there, I'll try to give you a shot of the fish. The lighting is never great to really see in the bag, but he's got some nice colors on him. So now I want to tell a little story about my worst experience with fish disease and how it relates to quarantine. So, I got a Yawaru cichlid and put it in this aquarium, and it looked perfectly fine in the store. And I brought it home and I didn't quarantine, and I put it in this tank, and noticed a few days later it had some spots on it. And this has been an ongoing thing that's lasted a while, actually. And that Yawaru had some spots on it that looked like ick. And so I treated it with heat and salt in this aquarium. And there were a lot of other fish in here. And those fish got over. Only one other fish got the spots. The Yawaru and one other fish. And both fish got better from having that ick. And everything was fine. And that Yawaru was in this tank for about a month. It was a great looking fish. And when I got my 210 gallon, I moved all of these fish, or a lot of the fish from this aquarium got moved into the 210 gallon. And with it, I moved the Yawaru. And as soon as I moved that Yawaru, which had looked healthy in this aquarium for 2 months, as soon as I moved it into the other aquarium, it broke out in ick again. And at that point, every fish in my other aquarium got ick. And I made a video about different ways to treat ick. And it was a big ordeal. I had 25 fish in there that were all expensive fish. And it's 210 gallons of water. And most of them had the outbreak. And I lost maybe 6 or 7 fish that I really liked, including the Yawaru. But quarantine would not have solved that problem with the Yawaru, because when I moved it within my own aquariums from one tank to another, it got ick. And it had an outbreak of ick that apparently was dormant for a month. So that's my personal experience, and I would relate it that in some sense, moving a fish from a fish store where it's been at that same fish store for more than a couple weeks, taking that fish and moving it into my aquarium is no different than moving it from my quarantine tank into one of my other tanks, because it did not go through a very strenuous, extended period of transit. And that, I think, is the big trigger for disease outbreak in fish that were healthy when they were shipped. And also, if the fish was unhealthy where it came from, then there's a good chance that in a couple weeks at a pet store, that health problem would manifest itself at the pet store. That's why if you're spending a good amount of money on fish and you have an aquarium that you really care about, if you can get your local fish store to hold fish for you, That's a great benefit. And a lot of stores aren't going to do that. Your PetSmart is not going to do that. Even a lot of your small mom and pop pet stores are not going to do that. But if you find the type of pet store that will do that for you, it's a real service. And it's a real testament to the quality of that store. Alright, so let's talk about this aquarium and why it has this mix of fish in it. I originally wanted this to be my South American tank with all my big South American fish in it, but then I got the 210 gallon and I moved all the big guys over there. At that point I said, what am I going to do with this tank? And I decided to make it a planted, peaceful community tank of mid-sized cichlid with some bottom dwellers and kind of the mix that we have here. And so I started planting it out. And we have, I believe, 7 sword plants in here. And if you know anything about Amazon sword plants, those things get enormous. They'll take up the whole backside of the tank. Then we've got some Vallisneria in here, some hornwort, some Anubias. This Anubias just keeps throwing off more leaves. It's really thriving. And so this is going to soon be a heavily planted aquarium. And just a real quick note on that. People will see a tank like this and say, you need a lot more plants in there. That would be like if I had this 125 gallon tank and I put 6 small Oscars in it. They're this big. You say, man, you need some more fish in there. Well, you know Oscars get big, right? And 6 Oscars in this tank would be overstock. Same thing with these plants. The plants that are in here now are going to quickly bush out and fill the whole tank. So, I keep getting that comment, like in my father fish tank, it's a 55 gallon aquarium with 25 plants in it. If I don't do anything, it's going to be so overfilled, there won't be room for any fish in it, just by leaving it alone. Now maybe you haven't had great experience with growing aquatic plants, but my plants are all growing well. And so I'm going to let them fill the tank on their own. But back to the stocking on this tank. Once I moved out all the big cichlids, I was left with the keyhole cichlid and the rainbow cichlid and this wide range of rams, and I think I had 6 or 8 angelfish. I thought, wouldn't this be a great tank to have angelfish in and make it just a jungle of angelfish? So now I'm up to 13 angels. So that brings us to the Discus. I've always wanted to keep Discus, but I let people scare me out of it and said Discus are too hard to keep, you won't be able to manage it in your hard water in Kansas, and they require daily water changes. Then I did a lot more research, and I believe I can keep Discus, and I'm only going to do once a week water changes. And in a heavily planted aquarium, I believe that is sustainable. So I've got a 125 gallon aquarium there that I plan to put a dozen Discus in. And buying a dozen Discus is a big investment. Discus are not cheap. So I've been using this tank as a test and a proof of concept to see if I can really keep Discus long term in my water under the way I keep an aquarium. And if I can't keep them the way I keep fish, then it's just not the right fish for me. So before I spend all that money, I've been using this aquarium as a test. I put that Discus in October 25th. So it has been 2 months and 3 days since I added that Discus, and he's been doing just fine, mixes with the other fish. But this is not an ideal aquarium for Discus. Discus are slow movers, and they don't like to really compete that much for their food. So when I feed this aquarium, there's so much activity with all these fish that it's not an ideal setup for a Discus. So I'm going to give these 2, I now have 2 Discus in here. If they make it another month or 2, I'm going to go ahead and make the investment, and I'm going to fully stock a Discus tank in that 125 gallon behind us. And I'm excited for the idea of that. But I mentioned earlier I was going to talk about the decision to quarantine these fish. And I told all of that story because I think it's relevant to the conversation about quarantine. So why do we quarantine fish? It's because the process of shipping them is very rough on the fish. We don't know what environment they're coming from. They could be coming in sick. If we isolate them in an aquarium, We can find out if they're sick before we expose our other fish to whatever else might be ailing that fish. But with something like a discus that's so fragile, if you put a discus into a quarantine tank that is not established and really not just cycled, there's a difference between cycled and mature. I think these fish need to go into mature aquariums that have plants, that have stable parameters. I have an empty aquarium right over there that is cycled, but it's not mature. It doesn't have plants in it. It's not a suitable tank for a discus. And I think taking a healthy discus and putting it in a substandard aquarium is more likely to cause the disease in the fish rather than reveal that disease. So I didn't want to put this discus into a substandard aquarium. I want to put it into this tank, which I've got 15 aquariums set up that are close to 1,000 gallons of water. And this is the only one that I would put a discus in, because it's mature and it's planted and it doesn't have aggressive fish in it. So that's why I'm not going to quarantine that fish. The other reason is it was quarantined by my local fish store who got it 3 weeks ago and has been holding it for me. And so the move from my local fish store into my aquarium is no different than the move from my quarantine tank into my aquarium. But when it comes to quarantine, people say you can just have an empty tank and quarantine a fish by just throwing it in that tank. And I don't care for that strategy. I think if you're going to have a quarantine tank, it needs to have at least some dither fish in it to keep it cycled. It needs to have plants in it. It needs to be large enough. We're not talking, like, I just couldn't bring myself to put that nice discus into a 20-gallon aquarium with nothing else in it. I just don't feel like that's a mature tank. Like, that's a good home. I wouldn't buy that fish and put it in there. So why is it okay for the quarantine? So it's okay for us to have different opinions on it, and I'm just sharing what I think. And what I think is best for that fish is to get it into its permanent home as soon as possible. I'd like to know what you guys think about it. So I appreciate you taking time to watch the video. I'll put links on the screen to a couple more of our videos, and I'll see you next time.